The icy wind clawed through the barren plains of Celestis 9, tearing through the twilight as Commander Dane Kale wrestled with the failing controls of the Starfire 4. The craft bucked and groaned, its hull shuddering under the strain of chaotic atmospheric interference. Sparks erupted from the panels, and alarms screamed for attention. Dane's jaw tightened. "Come on, you stubborn hunk of metal. Just a little longer." Through the cockpit's cracked viewport, a frigid expanse of white loomed closer, dotted with jagged black spires of alien flora. He fought the controls with every ounce of strength, managing to level the shuttle just as its final engine sputtered and died. Impact came hard, slamming him against his restraints as the craft skidded to a halt. Snow sprayed like waves around the crumpled hull before the world finally stilled. For a moment, Dane dangled upside down, breathing hard, blood trickling down his temple from a shallow cut. His pulse steadied as he surveyed the damage. The cracked window, the sparking consoles, the eerie silence save for the howling wind outside. "Well," he muttered, unbuckling his harness and dropping onto the upturned ceiling. "Could have been worse." After donning his sleek, black survival armor, a cutting-edge fusion of protection and utility, Dane forced the Starfire's hatch open. Snowflakes immediately swirled around him, sticking to his dark blonde hair as he stepped into a frozen wasteland. The suit's tactical display flickered to life, relaying dire readings. Temperature, minus 45 degrees Celsius. Wind speed, 30 knots. Breathable oxygen negligible. "Mayday, mayday," Dane broadcast, his voice crackling over the comms. "Commander Kale of the ESS Vanguard. Is anyone receiving this?" Static. As he scanned the horizon, movement caught his eye, a flash of orange darting between two skeletal trees. Instinctively, he reached for his rifle, training it on the spot. But the alien forest stood still once more, shadows playing tricks in the storm. "Get it together, Kale," he muttered, but the unease lingered. His suit's sensors picked up faint heat signatures to the northeast, a direction that also promised shelter in the form of a geological formation. He began to trudge through the thigh-deep snow, each step deliberate, each glance over his shoulder a wary one. The figure emerged from the swirling storm like a mirage, a towering being, 8 feet tall, with skin that shimmered like molten gold and hair like a living cascade of flame. Dane froze, his rifle leveled at her chest. Her eyes, luminous and feline, locked onto his. Her armor, a complex weave of iridescent scales, clung to her powerful frame, accentuating her inhuman elegance. In her hands was a weapon unlike any he'd seen, its sharp edges and glowing core radiating menace. "You trespass on sovereign ground, human," she said, her voice resonating with the command of royalty. Dane raised an eyebrow, his translator catching up with her alien dialect. "I could say the same about your snowstorm wrecking my ship." She tilted her head, studying him with the detached curiosity of a predator considering its prey. "You are bold for one so fragile." "Boldness keeps me warm," he quipped. "Now, how about we put down the weapons and talk?" Her lips curved slightly, a mocking semblance of a smile. "I am Serina Karath, sovereign queen of the Solari Dominion, and you, human, are my prisoner." Dane smirked. "I'd usually prefer a drink first." They trudged together through the storm after Serina grudgingly agreed to lead him to her outpost. Despite her imposing presence, Dane couldn't shake the sense of amusement that underlay her sharp words. When they arrived at the hidden entrance of her sanctuary, the airlock hissed open, revealing a sleek interior carved from stone and metal. Warmth enveloped them as they stepped inside, and Dane immediately shed his helmet, breathing deeply. "This facility is temporary," Serina explained curtly as she activated the systems. "Yet sufficient." As she moved through the space, her golden form seemed to absorb the light, a mesmerizing effect that Dane couldn't ignore. He leaned against a console, observing her. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "for someone who just captured me, you're being surprisingly hospitable." Her eyes narrowed. "Do not mistake practicality for kindness." "Noted," he replied with a grin. "Still, you're not what I expected from a galactic queen." "And what did you expect?" she asked, folding her arms. "More robes. Fewer weapons." The faintest flicker of amusement crossed her features before she turned away. "Your kind fascinates me," she admitted. "Primitive, yet stubborn. Weak, yet you defy odds." High praise coming from an 8-foot warrior queen, he shot back. "Though I'd argue humanity has its strengths." She paused, her gaze cutting back to him. "Such as?" He met her eyes without flinching. "Resilience, ingenuity, and, occasionally, charm." The tension between them thickened as her golden eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer. "Do you truly think charm will save you here?" "Hasn't failed me yet." Her response was a sound halfway between a laugh and a growl. The storm outside worsened, trapping them together. Over the hours, they sparred with words, each probing the other's boundaries. Dane's humor deflected her sharpness, while her intensity stirred something primal within him. "You intrigue me, Dane Kale," she confessed eventually, her golden gaze steady. "Your kind should cower before me. Yet here you stand, defiant." "Maybe I see something worth standing up to," he replied, his voice low. Serena took a step closer, her imposing height almost overwhelming. "You tread dangerous ground, human. Good thing I'm already a little reckless." When her hand brushed his face, it wasn't the blow he half expected, but a surprisingly gentle caress. The air between them charged with an unspoken tension. "Madness," she murmured, almost to herself. "This cannot be." "Sometimes," Dane whispered, "madness is worth the risk." The kiss, when it came, was like an inferno meeting a gale, wild, unstoppable. Alien barriers crumbled, leaving only raw connection in their wake. Later, as they lay entwined in the dimly lit chamber, Dane traced the shimmering patterns of her skin, marveling at its heat and softness. "Still think humans are beneath you?" he teased. Serena smirked, her golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You are surprising, Dane Kale. But this changes nothing." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," he replied, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "After all, the galaxy has a funny way of making the impossible possible." Her expression shifted, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her regal features. Something more than storms brewed outside now, a bond that could reshape their voice. The artificial lights of the outpost hummed softly, casting elongated shadows along the sleek corridors. Dane Kale stirred from restless sleep, his mind swimming between the sharp reality of survival and the lingering warmth of his alien companion's presence. Serena Karath was nowhere to be seen, and for a brief moment, he wondered if the night they had shared was a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and desperation. But no, his body still ached in ways that confirmed otherwise, and the faint, tantalizing scent of her remained in the air. Pulling on his survival suit, Dane stepped into the main chamber of the outpost. Serena stood there, her tall, imposing form framed by the cold light of a monitor displaying a live feed of the storm outside. The tempest still raged, snow and ice battering the landscape like an angry ocean. "You're up early, Your Majesty," Dane said, his voice a lazy drawl. He leaned casually against a bulkhead, watching her stiffen at his tone. Serena turned, her golden eyes narrowing. "Do not address me so casually, human." He smirked. "After last night, I think we've passed the formalities, don't you?" A flicker of something passed over her face. Embarrassment? Annoyance? Both? She crossed her arms, her orange skin glowing faintly in the outpost's sterile light. What occurred last night was an anomaly. Dane took a step closer, his grin broadening. "Anomaly? That's what you're calling it." She pointedly turned her back on him, focusing once more on the screen. "It changes nothing, Dane Kale. Our species remain incompatible in every way that matters. Do not mistake indulgence for acceptance." "Indulgence," Dane repeated, the word tasting like a challenge. He closed the distance between them, his voice dropping lower. "Is that what it was?" Serena whirled to face him, her movements sharp, her height making her tower over him. "Do not test me, human." You know nothing of the forces you provoke. Dane tilted his head, undeterred. Then teach me. Her eyes searched his, something unspoken flickering between them again. The raw tension from before lingered, but this time it was tinged with something else: confusion, uncertainty, vulnerability. Before she could respond, the outpost shuddered violently, a low rumble reverberating through its walls. Both of them instinctively steadied themselves, their focus snapping to the console, displaying the exterior environment. "What was that?" Dane asked, his voice sharp now, all traces of levity gone. Serina's fingers flew across the controls, her alien script translating to Dane's HUD. "Seismic activity," she said grimly. "The storm must have destabilized the ice shelf." Another tremor hit, stronger this time. A red light began flashing on the control panel, accompanied by an urgent, guttural warning in Serina's native language. "Translation?" Dane asked. Serina didn't look up. "Structural collapse imminent." Dane grabbed his rifle and helmet, slipping into action mode. "Great. Just once. I'd like to wake up without my life being on the line." Serina's eyes narrowed as she moved swiftly to a storage compartment, retrieving her weapon and a pack of supplies. "Your complaints are noted, human. Now follow me. The lower tunnels might still be stable." The pair rushed into the corridor as another quake rattled the outpost, this one strong enough to send cracks spidering through the walls. Ice and debris fell around them as they descended deeper into the subterranean structure. "Remind me," Dane shouted over the cacophony. "Why would an advanced empire build an outpost in a collapsing glacier?" "It was not collapsing when we arrived," Serina snapped, leading the way with graceful precision despite the chaos around them. "Now keep moving, or your fragile body will not survive to offer further commentary." Dane chuckled despite himself, his heart pounding as he followed her. They reached a reinforced hatch, and Serina keyed in a code that made the door hiss open just as another tremor hit. Dane barely had time to dive through before the ceiling behind them gave way, sealing the upper levels in a thunderous crash. Panting, Dane glanced back at the now-blocked passage. "Well, that's one way to avoid awkward morning conversations." Serina glared at him, though there was a hint of amusement in her golden eyes. "You are insufferable. And yet here we are, together. Again." She ignored him, her focus shifting to the new chamber they had entered. It was a storage bay, lined with strange crystalline machinery that pulsed faintly with energy. A single console blinked, displaying a Solari interface. "This equipment," Serina murmured, her tone shifting. "It's functional. Ancient, but functional." Dane frowned, scanning the room. "What kind of equipment are we talking about?" Serina approached the console, her hands brushing over its smooth surface. "Terraforming technology," she said, all creeping into her voice. "This must have been part of an abandoned expedition. These machines could stabilize the region, perhaps even reverse the seismic destabilization." "Great," Dane said. "Fix the ice shelf, save the day." "What's the catch?" Serina's expression darkened. "The system requires a power core, one my people did not leave behind." Dane sighed, leaning against a nearby wall. "Of course, and I'm guessing your empire won't be sending backup anytime soon." She glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No, and even if they could, they would not." The weight of her words settled between them. For all her regal authority, she was as isolated as he was. "Then we improvise," Dane said after a moment. "If these machines were left by your people, maybe your tech isn't so different from mine. My suit's core." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Your core is incompatible. And even if it were, using it would mean sacrificing your survival systems." Dane shrugged. "We're not surviving much longer if this place collapses anyway." Serina stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "You would risk your life for a chance at saving mine?" "Let's call it human resilience," he said with a smirk. "Or maybe just my thing for stubborn alien queens." For the first time, Serina didn't snap at his audacity. Instead, she nodded, her voice softer. "Then let us ensure your sacrifice is not in vain." They worked side by side, racing against time and nature's fury. As the ancient machines hummed to life and the ice above groaned ominously, they both knew this was only the beginning of the bond forming between them, a fragile hope amid the chaos of two galaxies colliding. The hum of ancient machinery filled the chamber, vibrating through the icy walls. Dane watched as the crystalline panels flickered to life, casting ghostly patterns of light across Serina's towering form. Her copper hair caught the glow, transforming her into something almost otherworldly, ethereal and untouchable. Almost. These systems are stable, she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and awe. The terraforming mechanism is operational, but the calibration will require precision. If we fail, Dane finished her thought grimly. The whole shelf collapses, burying us in about 100,000 tons of ice. Correct, Serina replied, her tone unflinching. So, do try to follow my instructions carefully, human? Dane gave her a mock salute. Yes, ma'am. Just tell me where to plug in my fancy suit core and hope for the best. She arched an eyebrow at him. It would help if you showed a fraction of the respect this situation demands. Respect's overrated, Dane quipped, moving to the console she had pointed out. But if it makes you feel better, I'll focus on not dying. Deal? Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. Deal. Dane knelt beside the console, unsealing the access panel to reveal a jumble of ancient Solari circuits. His suit's AI immediately began scanning, overlaying potential connection points on his HUD. All right, he said, looks like your ancient tech and my cutting-edge human gear are about to have a very awkward first date. Serina frowned, leaning over him to examine his work. A date? You know, Dane said, grinning up at her, two strangers coming together under risky circumstances, hoping it doesn't end in disaster. Your species' idioms are as infuriating as they are nonsensical, she muttered, though the faint flush on her orange cheeks betrayed her amusement. Admit it, Dane said, his fingers deftly connecting the core to the console's main interface. You're starting to find them charming. I will admit no such thing. Serina shot back, straightening and returning her attention to the primary controls. With a soft click, Dane locked his core into place. The suit systems dimmed immediately, warning him that life support and power reserves were now running at minimal capacity. Core's in, he said, feeling the chill creep into his limbs as the suit's temperature regulators weakened. How's it looking on your end? The ancient machinery groaned to life, a deep, resonant hum that made the floor vibrate beneath their feet. Serina's golden eyes flicked between the cascading readouts on her console. It's working, she said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. Stabilization is commencing. But, Dane sighed. There's always a but. The energy output isn't sufficient, she continued. The storm's interference is disrupting the field. We need to amplify the signal manually. Dane glanced around the chamber, noting the sparking wires and precariously balanced equipment. And by manually, you mean one of us gets to climb into the death trap up there and play mechanic? Serina hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. Yes, and you are in no condition. Nope, Dane interrupted, already striding toward the maintenance ladder leading to the upper relay. We're not doing the noble sacrifice speech. You're better with the tech, and I've got more experience with death traps. I'm going. Her hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. You could die, Dane Kale. He turned, his usual smirk softened by something genuine. So could you, Your Majesty. But if I don't try, we both definitely will. Trust me on this. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, reluctantly, Serina released him, her fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. Be careful, she said, her voice quieter now. Careful's my middle name, Dane said, climbing the ladder. Right after reckless. The upper relay chamber was a chaotic mess of frost-covered machinery and sparking conduits. The storm howled louder here, the vibrations from the machinery blending with the distant roar of collapsing ice. Dane's HUD blinked with warnings as his suit's temperature dropped further, frost forming on the edges of his visor. All right, I'm at the relay, he said, his voice crackling over the comms. Tell me what I'm looking for. Serina's voice came through, steady and commanding. There should be a primary control module to your left. You'll need to reroute power through the auxiliary circuits. Got it, Dane muttered, prying open a panel. Sparks flew as he exposed the ancient wiring, the cold making his fingers stiff and uncooperative. You know, for an advanced empire, your maintenance access points are a nightmare. Your complaints are noted, Serena replied dryly. Focus, human. Yes, ma'am, he said, his grin returning despite the situation. As he worked, the storm outside seemed to grow louder, the vibrations shaking the relay chamber. A sudden lurch nearly knocked him off balance, and he clung to the console, his breath fogging up the visor. Dane! Serena's voice snapped through the comms. The ice shelf is shifting. You need to hurry. No pressure, he muttered, his hands moving faster. With a final twist, he reconnected the last circuit, and the machinery surged with power. The hum grew deeper, resonating through the walls like a heartbeat. Serena, the relay's active, he called. How's it looking down there? Her reply was immediate. The stabilization field is holding. You did it. Dane leaned back against the console, relief flooding through him. See? Told you I'm good with death traps. But his relief was short-lived. A new warning blared on his HUD, a structural collapse in the upper chamber. Before he could react, the ceiling above him gave way, a massive chunk of ice plummeting toward him. Dane! Serena's voice was sharp with panic. He barely managed to dive to the side, the impact throwing him against the wall. Pain shot through his side as debris pinned his leg, and his suit system screamed warnings about critical damage. Serena, he said, gritting his teeth. I could use some royal backup right about now. I'm on my way, she replied, her voice fierce. Stay alive, Dane Kale. That is an order. Yes, your majesty, he muttered, his vision blurring as he fought to stay conscious. I'll be right here, obeying. And then the world went dark. Darkness enveloped Dane Kale, a heavy, consuming void punctuated only by the muffled thrum of machinery and the faint sensation of cold biting at his skin. His suit's life support system struggled, its waning power flickering feebly against the crushing weight pinning him. Somewhere in the haze of his mind, he heard her voice. Dane, respond. Dane! It wasn't just a call. It was a demand, tinged with something that sounded suspiciously like fear. The thought of the formidable queen Serena worried about him was almost amusing. Almost. If only he could muster the strength to answer. The weight above him shifted suddenly, an icy slab groaning as it was lifted away. Dim amber light spilled over him, and then her face came into focus. Sharp golden eyes filled with intensity, her orange skin streaked with sweat and effort. You're alive, she breathed, kneeling beside him. Her hands moved quickly, brushing frost from his helmet before working to free his trapped leg. Define alive, Dane rasped, coughing weakly. His breath fogged the cracked visor of his helmet. Because I feel like I've been through a blender. Your species' ridiculous comparisons never cease to amaze me, Serena muttered, but the corners of her lips twitched. With one final heave, she yanked the last piece of debris away, revealing his battered armor. Dane gritted his teeth against the pain as she examined his leg. Fractured, she announced, pulling out a sleek device from her armor. The small tool emitted a blue light, which she ran along his leg. This will stabilize the injury temporarily. Temporarily? That's comforting, Dane said through clenched teeth as the device hummed and sent warmth through his limb. Serena didn't respond, her focus entirely on her work. After a few moments, she sat back, satisfied. You'll live, she said simply. Dane managed a weak grin. That's the best news I've had all day. Her golden eyes narrowed. You are reckless to the point of idiocy. You could have. Hey, he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. I got the job done, and we're both still breathing, so win-win, right? For a moment, Serena just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she stood and extended a hand. Come on, hero, she said, her tone somewhere between exasperation and amusement. Let's get you out of here before you freeze solid. Dane clasped her hand, and she pulled him to his feet with surprising ease. His leg protested, but the stabilizer held. Thanks, he said, leaning on her slightly as they started toward the exit. The storm outside had subsided, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The landscape was a dazzling expanse of snow and jagged ice, the sky above a strange, shifting palette of greens and purples. "We need to return to the command center," Serena said. "The stabilization field will hold, but the system requires constant monitoring." Dane nodded, though his gaze lingered on the horizon. "You ever stop and just take this in?" She frowned. "Take what in?" "This," he said, gesturing broadly. "Alien skies. Worlds we're not supposed to understand. Two people who should probably hate each other walking side by side instead." Serena was silent for a moment, her golden eyes following his gaze. "It is unusual," she admitted, "though I do not fully understand why you insist on romanticizing every situation." "Part of my charm," Dane said with a grin. "Debatable." Their trek back to the outpost was slow, the harsh environment making every step a challenge. But they finally reached the hidden door, its metal surface now dented from the earlier collapse. Inside, the command center was just as they'd left it, the amber lighting casting long shadows. Serena immediately moved to the console, her fingers dancing over the controls. Dane eased himself into a nearby chair, letting out a relieved sigh. "Status?" he asked. "The stabilization field is maintaining its integrity," she replied. "But there's another problem." "Of course there is," Dane muttered. "Lay it on me." Serena turned to him, her expression serious. "The energy signature that brought you here, it wasn't a natural phenomenon." Dane frowned. "You're saying it was a trap?" "Not precisely," she said. "But someone or something activated a signal to draw attention. And I suspect it wasn't random." The implications settled heavily between them. "So," Dane said, leaning back, "what now? Do we sit here and wait for whoever set the bait to come knocking?" "No," Serena said firmly. "We prepare. If this was a test, we will not fail." Dane's grin returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I like the way you think, Your Majesty." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "You should rest, Dane Kale. You've done enough for one day. And leave you to handle all the excitement alone? Not a chance." For the first time, a genuine smile graced Serena's lips. "Your persistence is infuriating. And yet, here we are," Dane said, gesturing between them. Her smile lingered as she turned back to the console. "Indeed, here we are."